It was a warm afternoon in June 2001 when the streets of Long Island went quiet for a few seconds after the shots stopped. A black truck sat at the light, riddled with holes, smoke rising slow from the hood. The man behind the wheel wasn't some random dude. That was Eric E-Moneybags Smith, the Queens hustler who once had the nerve to rob Puff, talk slick to Jay-Z, and get caught up in the same stories that left Tupac bleeding. No warning, no mercy, just payback, moving fast. The hood said he died how he lived, loud and fearless. But to understand how it got to that point, we gotta rewind to where it all started. Back in the late 80s, South Jamaica, Queens was a different kind of jungle. The kind where the strong didn't survive by luck, they survived by being smart and cold. Crack money ran through every block, and the kids who grew up there learned early that loyalty and betrayal shared the same sidewalk. Eric Smith came up in that chaos, a quiet kid who watched everything around him and understood that fast cash was the only language people respected. He wasn't out there making noise. He was studying moves, learning who really had power and who just looked like they did. The streets around 150th Street and Guy Brewer Boulevard carried a reputation. That was Supreme Team territory, and everybody knew it. Kenneth Supreme McGriff had already turned the neighborhood into a real-life empire, mixing business with fear until even the cops walked light around there. For kids like Eric, that was the blueprint. Supreme's name was legend, and the code he built ran deep through Queens. Get money, stay solid, never snitch, and protect your name. Eric took all that in and started making his own path. He wasn't born rich, and there wasn't no shortcut waiting for him. He did what most young hustlers did back then. Boosted clothes, hit quick licks, and ran scams that made enough to keep him dressed like somebody. People in Queens started calling him Moneybags because every time he popped out, he was fresh, driving something clean, talking like he already made it. But it wasn't just about flash. He had nerve, the kind that made other street dudes take him serious. By the early 90s, his rep stretched beyond his block. Word was, E-Moneybags didn't care who you were. If you looked soft or moved sloppy, he'd take from you. Drug dealers, hustlers, even local rappers moving funny with jewelry. Nobody was too big to get touched. The streets respected that kind of boldness because in Queens, fear meant weakness. He wasn't reckless though. He was calculated, always picking his targets and keeping his mouth shut after the fact. The talk around him grew louder. Some called him a stick-up kid. Others said he was more like a strategist who played by street politics but kept his image clean enough to move around. He didn't drink heavy, didn't smoke much, just focused on stacking cash and building his own name. Around the time most dudes were catching cases or getting caught slipping, he was already climbing into a different lane, the one where money, power, and music started to overlap. Queens had seen plenty of street legends, but E-Moneybags had something different about him. He wasn't chasing fame, but fame started chasing him. The same blocks that made him fearless also filled him with enemies who waited for the day he'd slip. The same corners that gave him status would one day circle back like ghosts. Queens built him tough, but in that world, toughness always came with a price. By the early 90s, New York rap was exploding, and Queens was right in the middle of it. Every party, every studio, every street hustle had somebody trying to connect the two worlds, the rappers with the fame and the hustlers with the cash. E-Moneybags already had respect on the streets, and that made him valuable in a city where credibility could buy access faster than talent. He started showing up at the same events as the rappers, not as a bodyguard or a hanger-on, but as a man everyone already knew not to test. Through that circle, he met Kenneth Supreme McGriff again, this time not just as a neighborhood legend, but as a businessman trying to cross into music. Supreme had links to Irv Gotti, the mastermind behind what would become Murder Inc., and together they were laying the groundwork for something big. E-Moneybags became part of that extended family. He wasn't officially signed to anything, but his name carried enough weight that people wanted him around. He connected with Ja Rule and the Murder Inc. crew, not as a rapper, but as someone who made sure things stayed smooth when the music money mixed with the street world. Back then, rappers wanted to sound like the streets, but E-Moneybags was the streets. His charm helped too. People said he had a calm confidence that made everyone listen when he talked. He wasn't the type to brag, but when he spoke, his words had that quiet authority that only real ones carried. Rappers respected him, hustlers respected him, and even promoters moved careful around him because they knew he didn't need anything from them. But with that kind of presence came tension. Some in the industry saw him as a threat, not because he rapped, but because he reminded them that the world they glorified still had real consequences. Jealousy started to creep in. People whispered that he had too much influence, that his name was getting mentioned in rooms where he wasn't even present. By the late 90s, his circle included rappers, label heads, and gangsters, and that mix never stayed peaceful for long. The industry wanted his energy, but the streets wanted his loyalty. He was walking the thin line between fame and danger, and in Queens, that line never held for long. He wasn't chasing clout, but his name was becoming legend again, this time across both worlds. Everybody wanted to stand next to him, but nobody wanted to be standing there when the heat came. By the mid-90s, New York was booming with rap money, flashy cars, and record label egos the size of skyscrapers. Puff Daddy was running the city with Bad Boy Records, and every party he threw looked like a movie. Champagne everywhere, bodyguards posted up, and a whole image built on shine and success. But behind the music, the streets were watching close, because in Queens and Brooklyn, fame didn't mean safety, it meant attention. Word started spreading around that Puff got robbed. It wasn't just any robbery either. It was a humiliation that the whole city whispered about. The story hit the streets fast, saying some Queens dudes ran up on Puff and stripped him for jewelry, cash, and pride. Some said it happened in Harlem, others said it went down near Manhattan, but the story's impact didn't depend on where, it depended on who did it. The name that kept coming up was E-Moneybags, the same Queens hustler who already had a rep for robbing dudes that thought they were untouchable. Nobody could prove it clean, but the whispers wouldn't die down. In the streets, a rumor that strong might as well be truth, especially when it came from sources tied into every block from Jamaica Avenue to Brooklyn's Marcy. Some claim Baggs did it himself, walking straight into Puff's circle like he belonged there. Others said he sent the play, greenlit it, and let his crew handle the work while he stayed clean in the background. Either way, everybody knew it carried his stamp because that move had his kind of confidence written all over it. Robbing a regular hustler gets you respect, but robbing the city's biggest star made you legend. Puff had built his image off power, off being the man who moved with guards and walked into rooms like a king. Getting touched like that shattered that illusion in the eyes of the streets. It wasn't just about losing jewelry, it was about getting checked by someone the industry tried to ignore. Diddy didn't speak on it publicly, but the tension ran deep after that. Behind the scenes, whispers said he tightened his circle, made sure security was tighter, and kept certain Queens cats at a distance. That move shifted how the entire industry moved around street dudes, because if E-Moneybags could rob Puff, nobody was really safe. It also opened the door for other hustlers to start seeing rappers as targets instead of heroes. Around that same time, November 1994, Tupac got shot inside Quad Studios in Manhattan. 5 shots, robbed for jewelry, and left on the floor bleeding while industry folks watched it unfold. Pac later said it himself, that New York was moving grimy, that certain people smiled in his face and set him up behind closed doors. His anger toward Bad Boy and the East Coast scene started right there. Street Talk linked both stories together, saying the same kind of Queens and Brooklyn underworld connections tied it all. Cats like Haitian Jack, Jimmy Henchman, and names tied to Southside circles all got mentioned in barbershop talks and federal paperwork later on. E-Moneybags' name floated in that same air. He wasn't confirmed, but he was close enough to the action to be seen as part of that world. To the streets, robbing Puff and being connected to that kind of energy made him unstoppable. To the industry, it made him radioactive. People respected him, but they also feared being on the wrong side of his moves. Rappers started rapping about street codes, but most of them stayed silent when his name came up. That robbery changed everything. It reminded the industry that Queens still ran by real rules, not chart positions. After that, E-Moneybags wasn't just a hustler with connections. He was the name people whispered when they talked about the city's real power. It didn't matter if he pulled the trigger or just made the call, because in New York, perception was everything. And E-Moneybags was now the man even the famous didn't want to test. By the late 90s, E-Moneybags had already become one of those names that carry weight across boroughs. Brooklyn respected him, Harlem knew him, and Queens stood behind him heavy. Somewhere between that fame and fear, he crossed paths with another rising giant, Jay-Z. Jay was making noise with Rockefeller, turning street hustle talk into platinum records. But around those same years, the street world and the rap world were so mixed up that egos collided naturally. The story goes that E-Moneybags and Jay's circle got into a dispute over money tied to mutual business connections. Some say it was about a deal gone sideways. Others claim it was simply about respect, the kind of thing that never stays quiet long in New York. The details changed depending on who you asked, but the tension was real. There were reports of a heated exchange at a Manhattan event, and some street insiders said it almost turned ugly before a cooler head stepped in. What made it worse was that neither side wanted to look weak, and both had reputations to protect. E-Moneybags wasn't the type to talk tough for clout. He'd already built his name through action, and that scared people more than any verse or headline could. Jay, on the other hand, understood the difference between street smoke and business smoke. He kept his distance, choosing to stay focused on his music empire, but the shadow of that conflict lingered. In interviews years later, people close to both sides admitted there was bad blood, even if it never reached full war. For Jay, it was another reminder that his old world and new world couldn't mix cleanly. For E-Moneybags, it was proof that he could walk into rooms filled with industry giants and still command respect without a hit record. That small clash added to his growing reputation. People started saying he was too real for rap circles, that his energy couldn't be controlled by contracts or cameras. Artists respected him, but they also understood that being around him came with risk, because his life didn't move by the same rules theirs did. By the time word of that dispute reached the streets, his legend had already outgrown the rumor. He wasn't just a hustler anymore. He was part of the conversation when people talked about the city's real power players. Queens loved him, the industry feared him, and everyone else watched to see what move he'd make next. By then, his name moved in whispers, too close to supreme, too respected to challenge, too fearless for most to even approach. November 30th, 1994, Manhattan, Quad Recording Studios. That night changed hip-hop forever. Tupac rolled up thinking he was there for a session with Bad Boy affiliates, not knowing he was walking straight into a setup that would split the rap world in half. Inside that lobby, bullets tore through the air. Pac caught 5 shots before he hit the floor, bleeding heavy, stripped of his jewelry, while people upstairs kept recording like nothing happened. Right after the shooting, the streets caught fire with rumors. People in Harlem, Brooklyn, and Queens were talking like they already knew who was behind it. The names floating around weren't random either. Haitian Jack, Jimmy Henchman, Stretch from Live Squad, and somewhere in that same orbit, people started whispering about E-Moneybags. Nobody said he pulled the trigger, but they said he was too close to the people who made the call. Pac felt betrayed. He said it in interviews, in letters, and in his songs. He believed the same New York industry dudes who smiled in his face were the same ones that lined him up. He pointed at Puffy, Biggie, and everyone tied to that side, claiming they all played a role in letting it happen. When Pac dropped his interviews from prison, he called out names directly, saying they were scared to admit they moved dirty. In Queens and Brooklyn, people didn't argue with that. They knew how the city worked back then. If someone wanted you checked, it didn't need to be personal. It was business, and power was the only real currency. Haitian Jack was known for moving slick through those scenes. Jimmy Henchman had ties to artists, labels, and hustlers. And E-Moneybags, he had respect in the same streets those men controlled. He was moving around Queens and Manhattan circles that overlapped with every one of those names. Years later, court documents and federal files mentioned his name when they revisited cases tied to that era. Nothing ever pinned him to the shooting, but his name kept popping up around the same players. The streets believed he was in the room where those kinds of conversations happened, the type of places where decisions were made with a nod, not a contract. That moment did more than wound Pac. It drew a clear line across New York. After that night, Bad Boy and Death Row weren't just rival labels, they were war flags. Every beef, every diss, every fight in the next few years came from that night in some way. The tension in the city grew, and Queens was right in the middle of it. E-Moneybags' name started carrying even more weight after that. He was already respected as a street legend, but now people saw him as someone connected to one of the darkest turning points in hip-hop. His name lived between fact and myth, somewhere in that space where the truth didn't matter as much as who people believed he was. In those years, the line between rappers and hustlers completely disappeared. Street dudes financed the mixtapes, record labels hired muscle, artists moved with shooters instead of managers. Money, pride, and revenge all mixed into one ecosystem. E-Moneybags was comfortable in that world because he understood both sides. He knew the business behind the art and the danger behind the fame. The bigger picture always came back to Queens and Brooklyn. That underworld shaped the rise and fall of stars, from studio doors to federal courtrooms. What happened to Tupac in that elevator changed how everyone moved. But E-Moneybags didn't run or hide. The city got colder after that, but he stayed outside, living by the same code that raised him. By the late 90s, E-Moneybags had built his name into something bigger than street fame. He was moving in real rooms now, mixing with record label, bosses, and industry heavyweights. The one man he always stayed close to was Kenneth Supreme McGriff. Supreme was more than a neighborhood hero. He was a figure that defined South Jamaica, Queens. From his early days running the Supreme team to his rebirth as a music investor, he carried both fear and loyalty wherever he went. E-Moneybags and Supreme had mutual respect that went back years. They spoke the same language, came from the same corners, and understood power better than most people around him. When Supreme connected with Irv Gotti, who was building Murder Inc., it made sense that Bags was nearby. That circle was small, filled with people who trusted each other with both money and secrets. Murder Inc. was starting to take over the airwaves. Ja Rule was dropping hit after hit, with Ashanti, Charlie Baltimore, and others turning Queens into a radio empire. But behind those polished videos and platinum plaques, the foundation was still street. Supreme's influence stretched deep into that operation, and E-Moneybags was known as one of the men who made sure things stayed solid. He wasn't officially part of the label, but everyone knew who he was. When he walked into a room, artists quieted down, security stood straight, and executives gave that nod of respect. His presence said more than any introduction could. People inside the business liked having someone like him close because he gave them credibility. The streets saw him as the real one holding his ground while the rappers played their roles. But every move that made them stronger also made them targets. Rival crews envied Supreme's return to power and the success of Murder Inc. The money started attracting attention from the feds, who already had their eyes on Queens for years. Around 1999 and 2000, wiretaps and surveillance reports started connecting the dots between Supreme's street ties and the label's financial structure. E-Moneybags' name appeared in those conversations, not as a suspect, but as someone orbiting the same network. The feds didn't care if he was running a record label or helping friends. They saw everyone in that circle as part of one operation. It was the kind of heat that could burn anyone nearby. Inside the industry, whispers started spreading that Murder Inc. was being watched. Labels stopped picking up certain calls. Executives avoided specific meetings. The tension thickened. Irv Gotti tried to keep the focus on the music, but the connection between Supreme and the streets couldn't be hidden. For E-Moneybags, that world was all he knew. Loyalty mattered more than headlines. He stood beside Supreme even when the pressure started getting real. But behind the scenes, people could feel something shifting. Queens wasn't as united as it once was. Old grudges, new money, and growing paranoia began to break the circle apart. By early 2001, the streets were loud with rumors. People said the feds were ready to move. Others said internal beef was bubbling inside the same crews that once broke bread together. Bags was caught in the middle of it all. The industry was watching, the feds were listening, and somewhere in Queens, enemies were waiting. By that summer, everyone knew something was coming. Bags had too many friends to stay safe and too many enemies to walk free. The streets were buzzing, the walls were closing, and his story was heading for a violent ending. June 1st, 2001, Roosevelt, Long Island. It was a hot Friday afternoon, the kind of heat that makes the air feel heavy. E-Moneybags had just finished a business meeting near Nassau Road and was heading back toward his Suburban. He wasn't hiding or moving, like a man scared for his life. He was relaxed, smiling, talking on the phone, living like someone who believed his name still carried enough weight to protect him. He got into his Chevy Suburban and started driving down Fremont Avenue. Around that time, a white SUV pulled up beside him. Witnesses said it moved smooth at first, just cruising. Then, without warning, the sound of automatic gunfire ripped through the street. Over 10 rounds went off in seconds. Windows shattered, tires blew. People on the block dropped to the ground behind parked cars, covering their heads while the echo bounced through the neighborhood. When it stopped, E-Moneybags' truck sat there, engine smoking, riddled with holes. His foot was still on the gas, the tires spinning weakly as smoke rose from the hood. He'd been hit multiple times in the chest and shoulder, and before the ambulance could get there, he was gone. The same man who once moved through New York untouched now sat lifeless behind the wheel. The police arrived minutes later, taping off the street while neighbors whispered from their porches. Nobody wanted to talk, but everybody knew. This wasn't some random robbery gone bad. It was a hit, planned clean and carried out fast. The people who did it knew exactly where he'd be and when he'd move. By the time the news broke, Queens was already quiet. Word spread quick through Southside, Hollis, and Jamaica. People didn't even have to ask who did it. The way it happened told them everything. Rumors started flying within hours. Some said it was a setup over money. Others said it was payback for old business that had finally caught up. The name that came up the most was Kenneth Supreme McGriff. Whispers said Bags had fallen out with Supreme weeks before the shooting. Something about a disagreement over cash or a deal gone sideways. The street said Supreme didn't like being challenged, and when pride gets involved, peace stops being an option. Nothing was confirmed, but that rumor never died. When detectives dug into the case, they found connections that pointed straight back towards Supreme's circle. Years later, federal prosecutors said members of his crew were tied to the murder. Names like Anthony, Wolf Jones, and other Queens figures started appearing in documents and witness statements. It became clear this wasn't just a neighborhood beef. It was business mixed with betrayal. The case grew bigger when federal indictments hit Supreme and Murder Inc. associates a few years later. The prosecutors described Baggs' murder as part of a larger criminal operation. They said it was ordered as retaliation for disrespect inside the same network that once called itself family. For Queens, that moment hit deep. It felt like a chapter closing. E-Moneybags wasn't just another hustler. He was a symbol of how far street fame could go before it turned deadly. People who knew him said he always lived by his own code. He didn't bow, didn't beg, and never ran from anyone. That day in Roosevelt marked the end of an era. The hustler who once robbed legends and dined with rappers died on the same terms he lived by, outside with pride, with his name still echoing through the city. After his death, the investigation kept digging deeper into Queens. Law enforcement started connecting dots between E-Moneybags' murder and Supreme McGriff's wider operations. When the federal government finally brought charges against Supreme in the early 2000s, they made sure to include Baggs' killing in the case. They called it a murder for hire tied to old grudges and business disputes. In 2007, prosecutors presented evidence that Supreme had ordered the hit through his people. They linked it to the same underworld that surrounded Murder Inc., though Irv Gotti and Ja Rule denied having any part in it. Supreme was eventually convicted on multiple charges, including drug trafficking and murder for hire. The court said the E-Moneybags case showed how the streets had spilled into the music business. Years later, people in Queens still talk about that day like it happened yesterday. Some say Baggs knew the setup was coming, but refused to leave. Others believe he trusted the wrong people too long. In every version, the same truth remains. His death came from the same streets that made him. Rappers kept his name alive in lyrics, interviews, and documentaries. Old tapes surfaced, showing him speaking about loyalty and survival. On message boards and in barbershops, people debated whether he was a victim of betrayal or a casualty of the code he lived by. To some, E-Moneybags became a cautionary tale. To others, he stayed a legend, the Queens kid who stood toe-to-toe with stars and never folded. He blurred the line between myth and memory, between the man he really was and the stories people built around his name. He wanted to be respected, feared, and remembered. He got all three, but in the end, like every man who lives by the streets, he paid the final price. The city moved on, but his story never faded, because Queens never forgets one of its own.